So you're a historian at UC Berkeley, and you're probably most well known for your work around Black Power, and especially your book Black Against Empire, which I personally think is one of the best books out there about the Black Panthers. But you've also taught really extensively about the Montgomery bus boycott, and you know a lot of people that were in the boycott. So I'm wondering if you can tell us something about what the boycott means to you personally and about some of the people that you've met who were actually involved in the boycott itself.
Okay, for me, the Montgomery bus boycott is one of the most important moments in what people would call the classic phase of the modern civil rights movement. People start that at, some people like to start it in the 30s, some people like to start it in World War II. But the Montgomery bus boycott is typically seen as one of the catalysts, one of the initiators of sort of social movement action, especially among African Americans. And so I was very young when the Montgomery bus boycott transpired, but I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. And in 1960, when the four Black students sat in at the lunch counters and initiated the sit-in phase of the movement, that sort of like gave me my first sort of like memory. And then after that, I became very interested in sort of what came before that. And for me, the Montgomery bus boycott was clearly from the point of view of social action, collective action among African Americans, was sort of the moment in a lot of ways. Um, I was very interested in how, for almost a year, ordinary Black people stayed off the buses in protest, and how you sustain that kind of commitment, that kind of mobilization. And so that was one of the key questions. And a lot of it goes to sort of the kinds of connections, the kinds of networks, the kind of on the ground organizing that had already happened. And so for me, just sort of thinking about the nuts and bolts of sort of community action, community organization, and a lot of it coming through church networks, because those church networks were absolutely crucial, was another thing I was terribly interested in. Um, Over the course of my teaching, I came to know sort of several people. The one that I knew best was Mrs. Carr. Mrs. Carr was a lifelong friend of Rosa Parks, and they actually went to school together as young girls. And they both were very active in the NAACP. Like Rosa Parks, Mrs. Carr sometimes served as secretary, and then sometimes she was sort of like the one who headed up the youth council. This was typically a job that one of them or someone quite like them had. So she would come to the seminar that I was a part of, and so I got to know her well. And then on occasion, several of the other activists, especially people who had been involved in the youth councils, visited. And what was always fascinating was thinking about the fluid interaction between sort of church activism and political activism, the way in which the NAACP organized and mobilized through church networks, and sort of the distinction that a lot of people like to draw between sort of like political activism and religious activism. All of this melted away in the context of social struggle, or people organizing for social change. Um, and so for me, looking back and thinking about the Montgomery bus boycott, um, how thousands of ordinary people mobilized to protest having to have Jim Crow buses, and demanding equality of treatment on public transportation, was huge for me. And personally, I grew up using buses.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I always understood the centrality of buses for sort
Mm-hmm.
of like working class poor people, many of whom don't have cars. And they have to get to and from work. They have to get to and from other kinds of you know things they have to do in their lives. And so buses, were a key mode of transportation. It was also sort of a key place where you had interracial interaction because, whites and blacks often came together on these buses. So the structure of Jim Crow in the largest society was played out on buses.
So I want to build off of that to ask a question about, ever since the establishment of Jim Crow, segregated spaces were contested and fought against, but segregated transportation specifically seemed to be something that historically African Americans have fought against, more so than other segregated spaces. And I feel like you're talking already about why that is. Can we talk a little bit about a brief history of bus protests before we dive into the Montgomery bus boycott itself?
What's often not understood, and I think you point to this, is a history of resistance and protest against discrimination and prejudice in public accommodations and in public transportation, especially transportation. There's a whole history of this in the 19th century. The immediate predecessor to what happens in Montgomery is there are a series of protests in other places in the South, but Montgomery becomes huge because it becomes this social movement that lasts and sort of the mass media picks it up. But in the early 20th century, there is a whole range of protests against public streetcars, which are Jim Crow, and in over 25 cities throughout the South in the early part of the 20th century, there are a whole range of protests. Most of them are unsuccessful in overturning Jim Crow, but in some places, African Americans are able to get certain kinds of concessions about what can be tolerated and what will be allowed. And throughout the 20th century, there are isolated moments where this flares up. During World War II, for example, there are a whole series of episodes where some individuals and some groups protest. And so if you're looking for a prehistory, there is a strong prehistory to individual and collective protest against Jim Crow accommodations, and especially Jim Crow treatment in public transportation, whether you're talking about streetcars in the early part of the 20th century, whether you're talking about sort of trains, steamships, and the like in the 19th century.